In May 1940-5, in an Allied intelligence facility in southern Germany, a 60-9-year-year- at a table facing interrogation by American officers. He was Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the supreme commander of the Western Front, who had been responsible for the entire European fortress defense line from the Normandy beaches to the banks of the Rhine. His military career spanned half a century, witnessing the unprecedented victories of the German Empire and now experiencing its most complete collapse. His eyes held both unyielding defiance and a deep confusion. A military machine that had once swept across Europe now disintegrated in just 1 year. Captured less than a week earlier, he was exhausted but still maintained the reserve of a Prussian soldier. The interrogator posed a simple question: why did Germany lose in the West? Rundstedt gave 3 reasons: the Allies' absolute air superiority, which made all daytime military movements impossible. The severe shortage of motor fuel paralyzed the armored forces and grounded the Luftwaffe. The systematic destruction of the railway network prevented even a single train from crossing the Rhine. 3 clean, precise military answers from a professional soldier, each exact, objective, and irrefutable. Air superiority, fuel, railways, that was his final word. Yet he omitted a 4th factor. He did not mention trucks. Not trucks carrying ammunition, not trucks carrying fuel and food, but another kind of truck. Those loaded with doughnut machines, those carrying phonograph, records, coffee pots, and copies of Stars and Stripes. Those driven by young women who drove through artillery fire to reach the front lines. Rundstedt did not mention them because he simply could not see them. These trucks were invisible to him, not because they were hidden, but because they existed in a category his entire military education had no name for. The Wehrmacht had vocabulary for firepower, vocabulary for maneuver, vocabulary for logistics, but not a single word for delivering doughnuts and coffee to the front lines. This was beyond his cognitive framework. In his world, war was a mathematical equation about firepower, maneuver, and logistics. Using trucks to deliver doughnuts seemed as absurd to him as using a Tiger tank for food delivery. Yet this was not merely a military blind spot, but a fundamental divergence between 2 civilizations' understanding of the nature of war. The story begins earlier, in 1917, in the trenches of World War I. An American woman named Helen Provient Snelt in a flooded tent in France, frying dough with the last remaining flour and lard. She was one of the American Red Cross Doughnut Girls, a group of volunteers providing simple comfort to soldiers in the war zone. Outside the tent were muddy trenches and endless artillery fire inside. The aroma of frying dough filled the air. When soldiers lined up waiting for a hot doughnut, Helen realized she was giving them more than food. She was giving them a sense of being remembered, a feeling that someone cared, proof that home had not forgotten them. This realization became the starting point of a tradition, one that would reappear more than 2 decades later on a far greater scale. When World War II broke out, the American Red Cross launched the Clubmobile program. These converted to -ton GMC trucks were each equipped with a doughnut machine, coffee pot, phonograph, gum, cigarettes, and magazines. Operated by 3 young female volunteers, they were not military personnel, carried no weapons, yet voluntarily followed the army into combat zones. Their uniforms bore no rank, their records contained no combat history, but they appeared in the most dangerous places. On the beaches after the Normandy landings, in the freezing snow of the Ardennes forest, beside the bridge heads crossing the Rhine. In those days, a cup of hot coffee was more than a beverage, it was the taste of home, a symbol of normal life. It was evidence reminding soldiers that the world they were fighting for still existed. Every Clubmobile carried a sign on the back that read, "To bring you the warmth of home." This was not an empty slogan, but a promise. On June 6, 1940-4 D-Day, the Clubmobile women were already standing by. They arrived at Utah Beach and Omaha Beach with the landing forces, setting up coffee pots under fire and distributing doughnuts beside bomb craters. The seawater had not yet dried on their boots before the aroma of coffee was already drifting through the smoke-filled air. Many soldiers later recalled that in the darkest days after the landings, a clubmobile boosted morale more than any military order. A woman named Liz Richardson from Indiana was one of the most memorable clubmobile volunteers. She wrote in her diary that she came not out of bravery, but because she could not bear sitting at home waiting for news. She described a rainy day in Normandy, soldiers lining up in the mud. When doughnuts rolled out of the machine, a young soldier's eyes reddened. He said it reminded him of the doughnuts his mother made on Sunday mornings. She died in a plane crash on July 20-5th, 1940-4, at only 20-7. She was buried in the Normandy American Cemetery, Plot A, Row 20-1, Grave 5, forever alongside the soldiers she had served. Her headstone bears her name, not a rank because she was not military. She was simply a young woman who believed some things needed to be done. Her story is the epitome of the entire clubmobile program, ordinary people making extraordinary choices that changed the course of history. Meanwhile, the American military's morale support system extended far beyond the clubmobile. The Coca-Cola company with U.S. military support built 60 minus for bottling plants worldwide, ensuring every soldier could buy an ice-cold Coke for 5 cents. By the war's end, Coca-Cola had shipped over 10 billion bottles overseas. This number itself was a weapon. It told every American soldier that his country could fight a global war and still remember to send him a cold Coke. The Army Postal Service processed millions of pieces of mail daily, keeping soldiers connected with their families. A letter from home sometimes kept a soldier fighting more than a crate of ammunition. Stars and Stripes, written by soldiers for soldiers, provided news, sports scores, and a connection to home. USO shows brought stars like Bob Hope to the front lines, making soldiers laugh between battles. Even a military edition of Reader's Digest was compressed to pocket's eyes and stuffed into supply crates. These seemingly trivial measures constituted a vast morale infrastructure, a system the Germans could not comprehend at all. In the German concept of war, soldiers needed only 3 things: weapons, ammunition, and orders. Everything else was superfluous, a desecration of the purity of war. They could not understand why Americans would spend time and resources on seemingly irrelevant things in the midst of war. German generals' discussions of American material advantage ran throughout the entire post-war period. General von Mellenthin wrote that the Battle of the Bulge proved large-scale armored attacks had no chance under enemy air superiority. Lieutenant General Beerle described Operation Cobra as hell, with planes flying overhead like a conveyor belt and bombs falling like a carpet. Field Marshal Rommel wrote that enemy air superiority had an extremely serious impact, with no countermeasure available. Air superiority, fuel, bombs, railways, armor, these words filled post-war German accounts. Yet what was missing was something that could not be seen from 15,000 feet or through binoculars. What was missing was the Doughnut truck parked at the crossroads, the Coca-Cola colonel restocking the bottling plant in a French village, a soldier who had not received a letter from home in 3 weeks, reading yesterday's baseball scores in Stars and Stripes. These invisible things were precisely the true forces that determined the course of the war. In a manor called Trent Park in North London, British intelligence recorded what German generals did not know they were revealing. Between 1940- to 1940-5, 80- for captured German generals were housed at Trent Park, encouraged to converse freely. They did not know that every room, including bedrooms and bathrooms, concealed microphones. A fake aristocrat known as Lord Aberfeldy was actually an intelligence officer named Dean Monroe, who facilitated conversations and kept exchanges lively. He played his role so well that the generals never suspected his identity. British intelligence officers, many of them Jewish refugees from the Reich, sat in the basement transcribing over 60-4,000 conversations. These records, totaling approximately 100,000 pages, were partially published by historian son Ken Eitzel in 2007. The publication shocked the historical community, revealing that German generals are more candid in private than they admitted publicly. In those rooms, when the generals thought no one was listening, they spoke with a candor that published memoirs could never match. They discussed war crimes they had witnessed, the plot to assassinate Hitler, and the technical failures of German weapons. They returned again and again to the same question: why was an army that conquered France in 6 weeks being driven back? The published records focused on war crimes and ideology, while the American morale, infrastructure, was not prominent in the excerpts. But the underlying theme running through every conversation about defeat was material abundance. They could not get around this topic. Whenever they tried to explain failure, the conversation always returned to American materiel, not tactical errors or strategic mistakes. They had been told throughout the 1930s that Germany's enemies were weak, decadent, and incapable of enduring sustained sacrifice. Yet the enemy demonstrated strength in an unexpected way, a strength that insisted on comforts the Wehrmacht considered unnecessary. This strength became precisely the difference between an army that held together and one that fell apart. There is a widely circulated story about a German officer discovering a chocolate cake from Boston on a captured American position. This is a powerful image, but it is fiction. The quote comes from the 1960-5 film Battle of the Bulge. It was written by a screenwriter and never actually happened. Yet this fictional scene has become widespread because it touches a deep intuition. A nation that can ship fresh cake across the Atlantic does indeed possess a desperate advantage, but intuition is not fact. I tell you this because recording history correctly is more important than manufacturing drama. The German reaction to American abundance was less dramatic than the movie version, but more important. The real evidence is that Rundstedt listed 3 factors but not a 4th. The real evidence is what the generals omitted from their accounts. The real evidence is that Piper's soldiers held up Americans at gunpoint to steal their gasoline because the Reich could no longer fuel its own offensive. In December 1940-4, Europe's most experienced military professionals launched an offensive dependent on capturing enemy supplies. When the looting failed, the entire offensive collapsed along with it. What post-war German memoirs did not acknowledge is what historians defending the clean Wehrmacht myth spent decades excavating. German generals writing about American material superiority were not merely analyzing military defeat, they were constructing an alibi. If Germany lost because America had more trucks and fuel, then Germany did not lose because its officers enabled a genocidal regime. The material superiority argument was convenient, allowing the German officer corps to portray themselves as overwhelmed professionals rather than participants in a rotten system. This matters because German testimony about American logistics, while true, was colored by a need to make American abundance explain everything. The truth is more complex. American abundance was real, but the morale infrastructure worked because America used trucks to do something Germans never thought of. These trucks carried a message: "You matter." These 3 words were more powerful than any weapon, more far-reaching than any strategy. On May 20-3, 2012, the United States Senate passed Resolution 470-1, honoring the Clubmobile women. Senator Susan Collins said that for young soldiers fighting far from home, the arrival of a Clubmobile was one of the most important events. It took the Senate 60-7 years to say this, long enough for a war to fade from memory and a generation to move from prime to twilight. The women who drove trucks through Normandy and the Ardennes were in their 80s or 90s by 2012 if still alive. Many never publicly talked about what they had done. Many tucked their diaries and photographs into drawers and moved on. Liz Richardson is still there in Normandy, Plotey, row 20-1, grave 5, forever 20-7. She will never be older than the war that killed her. Time has frozen on her like an insect in amber. Her grave is in the same cemetery as the soldiers she served, those who needed 5 minutes to feel they had not been forgotten. She lies among them because in every respect except a rifle, she was one of them. She chose the same dangers and suffered the same fate. The question that opened this story, why couldn't German generals believe that American Doughnut trucks would follow the front lines? The answer is they couldn't believe it because believing it would require understanding something their entire tradition had not prepared them to understand. The Wehrmacht understood firepower, maneuver, and logistics, but not the mechanics of care. In the Wehrmacht's dictionary, a soldier was a resource to be managed, allocated, and consumed like steel and petroleum. The German military tradition was built on the assumption that soldiers existed to serve the state, their morale maintained through ideology and discipline. The American military tradition was built on a different assumption that the state existed to serve the soldier. Not perfect service, not without hypocrisy, but at its foundation, the American system was built on the idea that the democracy owed the soldier something in return. The young man in the foxhole had been sent there by a democracy, and the democracy owed him more than equipment and training. It owed him the acknowledgement that he was a citizen first and a soldier second, that his comfort and dignity were obligations, not luxuries. This was a fundamental difference in belief, not from military academies, but from a nation's understanding of its own essence. The American military understood something the Wehrmacht did not. The person in the foxhole was not a component, but a 19-year-old kid from Indiana. He had not slept in 3 days, he had watched his friends die, and he was being asked to stand up tomorrow and do it again. Whether he stood up or broke down sometimes depended on something that had nothing to do with training or equipment. It depended on whether someone in the vast machine behind him remembered he was a person. The doughnut was never about the doughnut. It was about the hand that handed it to him, about the woman from home looking into his eyes. It was about his country spending fuel and shipping tonnage to get that doughnut to him, not because the doughnut could win the war, but because the person eating it could. The women who drove those trucks understood what Helen Purviance understood kneeling in that flooded tent in 1917. Sometimes, the most important thing you can do for someone being asked to die for his country is to remind him that his country knows he is alive. Field Marshal Rundstedt, EEDT listed 3 reasons for Germany's defeat: air superiority, fuel, railways. He was not wrong about any of them. But he missed the 4th, the truck sparked at every crossroads, driven by women who voluntarily followed an army into war because they believed it mattered. He missed the truck, and because he missed the truck, he missed the entire war. The women on those trucks, their names never appeared in any military history book. Their contributions were never recognized by any medal. But what they did changed everything. They proved that in war's brutal equation, care is not a superfluous variable but the key constant that determines victory or defeat. And Rundstedt and his fellow generals, to their dying day, never understood this truth because the word for it never existed in their dictionary. If you want more hardcore breakdowns of history's deadliest miscalculations, smash that like button and subscribe. I am your strategy observer. I will see you on the next battlefield.